You're listening to episode 49 of This Makes Me Happy. Welcome to This Makes Me Happy, a podcast about people and what makes them happy. I'm your host, Bernardo Margulis. I'm a designer, art director, and educator, and I'm the principal of This Makes Me Happy, a design studio where I help my clients with branding and visual communications. I'm very happy to present This Makes Me Happy, the podcast, where each week I chat with a different person about what makes them happy. My guests come from all walks of life, and each of them shares their own personal happy stories. Join us every week for a unique conversation. Hello, welcome to another episode of This Makes Me Happy. Today I'm speaking with Mykim Dang. Did I say it correctly?
Mm-hmm.
I'm overly, I hate when people call me Bernard, so
You're
I just
so
want to make sure. I'm overly sensitive. And she is a multimedia and multi-format artist who lives and loves to make things. Hi, Mykim. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. And part of my sensitivity is we connected through Nate Nichols. And when he came on the show, he said that his secret skill is to get people's names right. So now I'm even more sensitive about it because he was my, he was
He's
here.
our common connector.
And he connected us. So I got to do him justice.
Absolutely.
But that's his secret skill. What's your secret skill, or is there anything you want people to know about you?
I think a big part of who I am has to do with the fact that I spent most of my childhood moving a lot. So I'm super adaptable and really good at being uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable physically, psychologically, both?
All things. I just think in general I'm really good at making a lot out of a little.
Do you push yourself out of your comfort zone on purpose?
I think it's almost just a default setting for me. Maybe I just thrive in really difficult situations all the time.
Before we started recording, we had a little pre-talk and we were talking about our intersecting paths. And I love that that's what you said, because I was just thinking today that I hate working in my comfort zone. I like making myself go out of it. So Here's another intersection in our paths.
Awesome. Not surprising.
So let's get straight to the main topic. What makes you happy?
When I think about happiness, I sort of think of this concept of what, I think most of us, we spend a lot of our time and energy outputting. And for me, that sort of balance between creation and consumption is a really clear connection. And what makes me happy is creating, making things. And I think, again, doing that across different mediums, whether that's literally making physical art or making connections between communities or people who might not normally have a conversation with each other or get to know each other because there are some outward biases that exist between two groups, right? I've always sort of been interested in what happens when you mix something black and white together, that kind of gray space. So I get a lot of joy and fulfillment out of taking things and experiences and mashing them together, things that you normally don't think go, and seeing what happens when you synergize them. So for me, happiness and fulfillment, all of that is really tied to the process of making the unknown known and doing it in different ways, whether that is through art, media, or even physically, right? Like I said, connecting with people, or me physically. I need to move every day. I was a pretty serious athlete for a good chunk of my life, and the pure joy that I get from my physical body moving in space and pushing limits and boundaries and exerting itself, even though it's sort of that opposite energy of, like I said, giving and expulsion and putting out, somehow in the physicality of that, I get a lot of fulfillment, joy, and happiness as well. So you can kind of see these themes of black and white, yin and yang, sort of dichotomies of things. One of my projects from when I was a kid, my first company was called Dichotomy. So I think that is a really, really important thing for me and what makes me truly happy.
So all these things that you're mentioning, your movement and dichotomy and creating and making, do you think these are different things that make you happy, or is it different manifestations of that creative energy you're talking about?
I think you're exactly right in how you just expressed it. It's the same thing, but expressed in different ways. 100%.
So your athleticism and your movement, that's also making and creative in some way?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. I think most people don't really associate perhaps, athletics as a whole in as an art form or something that's artistic. But I think a lot of what you do with your body and athletes, whether it's recreational or professional, that to me is like a whole other level of expression and art form. So the connection to me is very clear.
Is it, in a way, I'm thinking a different way of putting it maybe is transforming, where with art you're transforming content, you're transforming media, you're transforming element, and with movement and exercise you're transforming energy and thought and
yourself. Yeah.
So has that been an issue with you in terms of your creativity? Do you explore the transformation? You said dichotomy. Is that a going from one place to another, or is it simultaneous dichotomy?
I think, I really like how you position the transformation piece of it and like getting from point A to B, and then the process of what's happening to you and being aware and tapping into that as you go. Some of those adages you hear, right? Like, happiness is about the journey, not the destination. Corny to some extent, but really true. I think what happens to you when you go from go through a state of change rather, is the thing that I find very human and very compelling. And again, very energizing and fulfilling.
Has this always been the case for you? Did you always know that making and transforming and creating make you happy, or was that a discovery process?
I think I inherently knew from when I was very young that this was an integral part of what, I don't know, it sounds very dramatic, but it was almost like a survival mechanism because of all the movement around me as a kid, the instability, the transformation of my physical environment, and thus, my emotional environment. I found some agency in being able to make things, right, that were independent of those other factors. So I think maybe I didn't know what to call it or what I was doing, but I was always sort of operating in this mindset and doing these things from a very early age.
How do you remember how early this happened?
Yeah, I think, maybe around 6, 7, 10 is when most of my memories actually really crystallize. I think stuff before that is very, very fuzzy. I don't remember a lot of my earlier childhood, to be honest. But those early adolescent times, middle school, and I was moving quite a bit then too, always having to make new friends and kind of reinvent yourself and figure out who you are when you're already doing that in that age anyway. It was crystal clear to me that the only thing I had control over was my ability to output, and the only way that I could have an effect on how I was feeling and how happy I was couldn't be tied to any of the other things around me, because they just were not flowing, or they were always changing.
Something you just mentioned, making friends, and earlier you said that part of the creation is also making communities. How do you think, or why do you think is the connection, or is there a connection between your creative process, creating the communities, making those friends? Is there a common thread there, or is there a cause and consequence?
I definitely think there's a thread. I'd say, the art that I was making at an early age, and one of my best friends from childhood, our first thing that we started together was a skateboard design company. And that was born out of trying to connect with other people like us in that community that we couldn't find. So creating those connections, again, was sort of a survival mechanism. And then how I approach my making, I felt like, okay, I'm doing all this stuff on an individual level to survive, to express myself. I get joy out of it, but how do I take it a level further? What if I could reach someone who is experiencing exactly what I was, but had no way to connect with the world outside them? So that, I think, inherently became the common thread, as you mentioned, and a very important part of my process. It's like you make something and you have to let it go and put it out into the world, because if you just make it for the sake of making it and keep it for yourself, yes, of course, there's value to that. And I have always achieved some level of fulfillment from that process. But it wasn't until I put it out there into unexpected places and unexpected hands that I really started to feel that true level of almost, pure joy and ecstasy. It just, to me, is sort of the natural way to make a bigger impact and connect in more influential and substantial ways.
So does that mean that what makes you happy is where your creations go, or is that another aspect of the creative process?
I'm not sure. I think that I'm less concerned with the end result and more interested in the fact that it goes somewhere. Again, that it has movement, that it doesn't just sit still, and transformation can take place.
Do you ever create for yourself?
Yes. In that case, I think I usually turn to that act when I am feeling overburdened with all of the external demands on me. The work that I do is creative. You can relate to that. It's a really kind of hard line to walk, because art for art's sake, I think, is very different when you're making a living off your creativity and a living from your art, right? So I think when it gets really demanding and it's tied to maybe a line item or a business objective or a client, that's when I might have to retreat back into just making something only motivated by what I feel I need in the moment. But I eventually, for the most part, share it with the people closest to me in the communities I have built over the years. So I actually think I rarely keep things only just for my own eyes. But sometimes I start with that intention when the external world is pressuring me too much. So
you work in the creative industry. You make videos and films and documentaries, and is that for you art, or is that because it's for commercial purposes? Is that something else?
I think the role that I'm in now, from transitioning to an independent sort of small shop into a larger organization, there's a tension that exists that I'm actually interested in, going back to, my curiosity and fascination and joy of exploring, black and white and what's in between. Commercial content and then sort of independent or content-driven content, not, let's say, ad-driven content, are two very different worlds at first glance. But I think creatively there's a lot of overlap in how you can tell stories in those mediums and why you might be telling stories to sell something or to connect with someone, right? To me, being in the industry, I have a responsibility to investigate what those two ways of creating are, especially in today's world, and bring that conversation and what I find in that process to the table and to the other makers out there who are also working in and out of this actual industry.
Yeah, I just found curious the way you were talking about, you specifically mentioned when you make a living out of it. I've had this conversation a lot. As a designer, people say, well, you're an artist. And I draw a line because I need a client, I need a problem, I need a paycheck to design. I'm not in my studio. And I think what you said is very important. You have a responsibility for what you're putting out there. It's not just your own. And that's how I feel. So I'm curious that you, coming from an artist perspective, you have a very similar view in that you have responsibility of having to communicate something for someone else, as opposed to what you do for art or
correct
on your own time.
Just for yourself. And I found as I've gotten further in my career and, just older, it's strange because the energy that I have is much for my outside projects. So let's say things that I do outside of work that make me really happy. It's laser focused and it's really deliberate, right? Because I'm so much more aware of how much I have to output at all times in all these different situations. Whereas when you're maybe less experienced or younger, it's not a hunger thing. My appetite for all of this type of creating is still there, but I'm just much more deliberate about how I execute against it and very aware of, say, like, if I do something like this, it makes me feel this level of joy or happiness. But if I do that and, maybe it's a slow burn and it's a bigger project and it's spread out over time and maybe I'm collaborating with people on it, that's a different type of activation and happiness that I get. So I think when I was just starting out, I was just trying everything with no real awareness of what was going on throughout that process.
Currently, do you get equal joy from those personal laser focused projects that you do versus the commercial for your day job in terms of creativity?
I think I do. I think my levels are the same, but they're kind of going to different places, if that makes sense. Like you said about, having your own design practice, you're solving a problem for a very specific brief or a specific client. And I'm sure after you successfully solve that problem through a creative process and presenting a design solution, you feel something, right? You feel energized, you feel accomplished, you know that you've done well and your best, and you've created an answer to some intriguing question. I think the same things can happen in personal projects and in your own process, but maybe, just maybe, it feels a little bit more satisfying because it wasn't to an end. And maybe that goes back to the root of, art for art's sake. And maybe if we're creative people at the heart of it all, that's kind of always going to be the kernel of what makes us maybe the happiest. But I'd say I see the purpose in both. For me, it goes back to that sort of responsibility conversation. And I feel myself creatively, I'm actually quite left brain and right brain. I can kind of gravitate and switch gears on and off when I need to. Again, it's sort of that awareness piece that I think maybe some artists and that's cool. Like you can stay on the side of, my partner is the total opposite of me creatively. Like he works on projects for years and he doesn't care about who's going to see it or what's the purpose. And it's for him and he gets his joy from that. And for me, again, I see both sides of that coin. And I think it's okay to go back and forth between those worlds.
I might be a weird one because I love my personal projects, but they're always in on the back burner. I get the most joy when a client tells me like, "Oh, this piece communicated like we got a 200% higher response." I would rather have the client be happy and the piece fulfill their needs than do my own projects. But I think it's more motivation than joy because I love doing personal projects. I'm not as motivated. Going back to this separation, and the reason why I backtrack was because I wanted to compare. Now you say you can do different kinds of attention to different projects. Do you think when you started out back 10 years ago, 8 years ago, do you think you would have felt the same way about commercial work versus personal work? Has it always been that way since you've been a professional creative?
So before I went out on my own, I was always working for other people. And I think the nature of the creative industry has been structured for so long of this concept of like, oh, when you start out, you got to work for free and you got to climb the ladder and do this and do that. And so I don't know what it was that sort of allowed me to do that, but also pursue my own passions simultaneously. If I hadn't had that motivation and willpower, I don't think I'd be where I am today. So I do think that awareness was there, but I didn't know it. And I wasn't talking about it in the ways that I am now. But I definitely have probably always kind of functioned that way. But again, that level of awareness was not clear. Now I'm pretty calibrated, which I'm thankful for.
And what do you think that level of awareness has done to you in terms of happiness and joy in your creative process?
I think it's been very liberating because it allows me to not only deliberately make the choices I have about, how I spend my time, where and why, but also understand that with every choice, there is something that I am leaving behind or not putting on the table, right? I think sometimes we think about creative choices as, all or nothing or all in. We don't, again, consider the flip side of, so if you commit to this thing, that means maybe less time with your family or your partner or your social circles, right? If you work full time and have a really demanding client base, that probably means some of the projects that you have on your back burner are not going to get done for that period of time. So that awareness, I think, has helped me understand, again, I don't really like the word balance, but I think that's the word, right? That there is a lot of this push and pull and give and take in the creative process, and that happiness is something that is really fluid. But at the same time, if you are aware of it and know the elements of it that exist for you at sort of different states, depending on what you're doing, you might find it to be less elusive than it seems.
Do you actively create to be happy, or is that just something that happens?
I definitely think it's just a byproduct, very, very wonderful. The same way when, I move and endorphins are released and I feel less stressed or really empowered and then thus creative, it just happens that way. It's definitely, I never go in with the intention of, oh, I'm not feeling happy. And so I got to do this to feel happy. It's just never that simple for me.
I want to backtrack a little and unpack what you said earlier about movement and exercise. You said you used to be very athletic. Can you tell me a little bit about that? How that brought you joy? How did you discover? Why did you get into it? Are you still doing it?
Totally. So I'm doing different things now. I'm not competing anymore. That period of my life came about due to, unfortunately, a incident. I was attacked, just on the street. And so feeling very vulnerable after that and just wanting to understand physically, I'm also quite petite. So I think I'm, all of these things that I don't think about, but maybe the outside world sees me as, and, one day that all actualized into this event that kind of changed the way that I felt about my physical presence and thus safety. So I think that's an interesting concept that might tie to happiness. And so it was that thing that kind of sparked me to learn how to get stronger. And so I spent, the couple of years after that incident, probably going off the deep end, the opposite end of the spectrum, and just completely focusing all of my energy. And I got so much joy and happiness out of immersing myself into this really competitive world around strength training and CrossFit and just really intense activity. And then I got pretty sick in 2014 when I was traveling. I got this tropical disease called dengue, and that really just, again, topsy-turvied my world. And I realized in the recovery process for that, there were still ways to get that fuel and that happiness and that power, but not as through less intense methods. So the way that I move now is very different. I spend a lot more time in nature, doing more functional activities and tuning into my body and being super aware if I can. And again, much more, I'm still pushing, but in a very different way.
So it sounds like now it's more spiritual, psychological, the movement that it used to be.
I think so. Yeah, I still do a lot. I learned so much from that time, and I'm really thankful. And I incorporate a lot of those things into my training, but it's not against anyone else. It's not for, any specific record. It's weird because maybe you could say my fitness is like the traditional art for art's sake. Like I'm moving to move and to be healthy and to stay connected to maybe, my mind and my body simultaneously.
But maybe it could be that before you're competing and a competition is a winner versus loser versus now probably it's more of a creative, there's no zero sum in just doing it. You're just creating movement. You're just creating energy and rather than opposing it. Yeah,
exactly. That's a great way to look at it.
Do you think there's a relationship between your movement, between your physicality of the exercise and your more traditional creative endeavors?
I do. I don't know what kind of research has been out there, but I'm sure there's got to be some, which is funny to me because I know a lot of creative people are stereotypically not very active or in tune with their bodies, right? I cannot... I start my day that way. And if I don't, my ability to create is really hindered. So I definitely see the connection between them.
So if you have a day that you can't work out, you just can't create?
I can, but it's not at the level and quality that, I know it could be. And the whole process itself, I feel much heavier. It's slower. It feels like work when I think when you're really in your creative flow, it doesn't. Like you don't even know. I think, for me, that's when I feel like I do my best work, when it doesn't feel like work.
So what would be a typical creative day for you?
Yeah, my job is definitely my focus now. And I just am so immersed in it and so feel so fortunate to be doing the work that I'm doing that, that's what it is. I start my day with movement. I get to my office pretty early, kind of before the rest of the creative team tends to show up. And I think my morning hours are my most productive. That's when I usually set aside my more complex creative tasks to tackle first. And then being part of an organization now, I have to deal with lots of other teams and a lot of meetings. So that tends to take up a large portion of the day. But then there's obviously creativity in that, brainstorms, strategizing, bouncing ideas off each other with different people. So it's a different type of creativity where maybe I'm not using my hands to output, but my brain is lighting up. And again, I'm so constantly impressed and surprised by the teammates that I have in this organization that I'm now a part of, about how they challenge me and how they make me think, and how they think differently in ways that I just never would be able to, right? So I really appreciate that as part of the creative process as well. So maybe after that big afternoon chunk of meeting and collaborating, I will go back to now my primary medium at work is video, and really start, digging in and cutting and applying a lot of the stuff that maybe we had talked about during that middle chunk of the day. Then I take a break for dinner and food, which is also important. And then if I have time, I might do something physical again. And then depending on, what's going on, evenings, I try actually to shut down. Of course, that's really hard, I think, in our day and age, unfortunately. But I make sure that I spend time with, my friends and family who are close and came along on this journey with me, because I think that's really important too.
How would you feel if you had a week where you couldn't do deliberate movements or deliberate creative work?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I don't know. That sounds, actually, I'm blocking out. I did deal again with some of those health issues a while ago. So I did have both inability physically to move, and then also all of my energy and brain function. I just wasn't myself, obviously. So it was during that time that I couldn't do either of those things, and it was miserable. Not only did time feel slower than it ever had, I also just felt like I wasn't serving the purpose that I was put on this earth to do. It just felt so difficult and soul crushing, and just, I just didn't, what was the point? I suppose is how I was feeling, which I know seems really dramatic, but I don't know if I couldn't do either of those things. I just really don't understand, why. I don't know why exist. What are you doing here if you can't do either of those things that you feel are big parts of who you are and what you were put on this planet to do? So it would be very, very challenging for me to go without both of those things for an extended period of time.
Now, quite the opposite question. What if you had your way, ideal day, week, month, year, anything goes, you can decide what you create, when to move, how to move. What did that look like?
Oh man, I definitely would not be in an urban environment. I think I would be, definitely in the ocean, or on a mountain, either one of those things, with close friends and my partner and just the people in my family who are closest to me. And if I could create with them, I think that would be the most ideal use of that time, because I actually have been good about creating space for myself to do that, the sort of individual retreat. But I haven't yet in my life gone full force into a true creative collaboration that's extended over, say, a week or a month or whatever it is, that period of time. I think it'd be really interesting to be removed from your day-to-day environment with people that you really respect and admire their creative talent, and to be able to do something with them. So that would be what my ideal scenario would look like.
All right, let's move on to the rapid fire section. I have some quick questions about what makes you happy, and I want your gut reaction. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Who makes you happy?
My brother and my partner.
Where is your happy place?
My happy place is in the ocean on my surfboard, or on the mountain on my snowboard with my friends.
What's the happiest word you can think of?
Ocean.
Who is the happiest person you can think of?
I'm going to have to say Nate Nichols.
Thanks, Nate, for this connection. And the last one. What is the last thing you remember that made you happy?
The last thing I remember that made me happy was being home in Boston with friends in the ocean and on the mountain.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Mykim, if people want to find you, or if there's anything you want them to look out for, where can we do that?
Yes, absolutely. You guys can check me out on Instagram. It's just my name @Mykim Dang, or my website, which is the same, mykimdang.com.
Awesome. And I'll share the links. I'll share the link so that everyone can find it. Thank you so much for sharing what makes you happy.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me and inviting me to even entertain the question, because it's an important one.
Thank you, Mykim, for sharing what makes you happy. And thanks to Nate Nichols of episode 48 for connecting us. Thanks everyone for listening. And a special thanks to Jason Cepolo for ending this episode, Oilu Margulis for help with social media, and Rocio Castañeda for ongoing support. You can learn more about this project and get the past episodes at thehappypodcast.com. And you can find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at The Happy Podcast. We're also on YouTube, youtube.com/thehappypodcast. And you can sign up through iTunes for all the latest episodes on your device. And if you give us a 5-star review, other people can find us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.